This is the tale of ANA Flight 140, which took place on September 6, 2011 at around 9 a.m. Flight 140 was traveling from Okinawa to Tokyo's Haneda Airport at 3:30 in the evening. This was one of the numerous domestic flights connecting the various islands of the Japanese island chain. As the aircraft flew over Japan at 41,000 feet, the flight deck was calm. The captain was the pilot, and the first officer was occupied with keeping an eye on things to make sure that everything was in order. There was little activity on the flight deck as the aircraft, which had been in the air for a few hours, approached the waypoint known as Sekak. Around 10:46 p.m., the captain made the decision to go to the restroom, leaving the first officer on the flight deck by himself to control the aircraft. The flight deck may be managed and supervised by one pilot while the other is absent for a short period of time, especially during a trip where not much truly happens. For those of you unaware, this is totally safe and customary. Nonetheless, while the captain was out, a controller at Tokyo's Air Control Center phoned the first officer and requested that he slightly reroute the aircraft. The controller wanted the aircraft to fly straight towards the PGE VOR, which required a 3-degree right turn. Nothing too critical, but as soon as the first officer got this information, he started programming this new path into the Aircraft Control Display Unit, or CDU. The CDU was situated on the first officer's left side, just off to the sides of the throttles. As the first officer was busy entering the information into the CDU, he heard a chime alerting him that the captain was ready to return to the cockpit. With the captain waiting outside, the first officer quickly finished what he was doing on the CDU and began to reach for the switch that would unlock the cockpit door. The plane suddenly jolted to the left. The first officer added some right rudder to compensate for whatever was going on with the plane outside the cockpit. The captain felt the bang and heard the warnings at the cockpit. He immediately sent another message to the cockpit, asking the first officer to open the door. However, the door remained tightly shut as the plane banked more. The captain found it difficult to even open the door. The onboard computers were trying to bring the aircraft back onto the pre-planned flight path, but for some reason that wasn't working either. The autopilot was at its maximum setting at its control authority. As the roll to the right increased and it started to drop, there was more air flowing over the right wing, causing the passenger jet to get into a steeper and steeper roll to the left. The flight computer was also perplexed by what was happening. The plane was deviating from the flight path that was programmed into the flight management computer. A bank angle alert was sounding as all of this was happening, and the 737 was doing something that a 737 shouldn't really be doing in a matter of seconds. The autopilot was at its limit and was attempting to ride the plane as much as it could, but whatever was causing the plane to roll to the left was overpowering it in the cockpit. The first officer was also trying to save the plane, essentially commanding as much right rudder as possible to keep the plane from rolling uncontrollably to the left. All 117 passengers and crew members' lives now depended on the first officer's ability to right the rudder. For a brief period, it appeared that the plane was beginning to recover when the left-hand bank was reduced to 50 degrees. But that didn't last long, because the roll to the left quickly resumed. Meanwhile, Flight 140 was falling out of the sky, and its rate of descent increased from about 220 feet per second to about 440 feet per second at that point. Against all odds, the plane began to level its wings out of its terrifying dive, and in the cockpit, a litany of overspeed warnings were sounding, including the overspeed warning and the bank angle warning. As the plane pushed well north of Mach 0.8, the plane eventually stabilized and was flown to the destination airport without further incident. But now we need to know how a passenger jet can suddenly drop out of the sky and then take off as if nothing happened. The investigators looked at the plane's weight distribution, and if it was off, that might have been a contributing factor in what happened. The problem is, though, that if the plane had weight issues, they would have been obvious as soon as the plane took off. Take Flight 102 from National Air as an example. In that case, the aircraft never really gained altitude due to the way it was loaded, and Flight 140 was a mirror image of that. What's also interesting is that the issue appeared to be resolved on its own, whereas this would not be the case with the weight and balance. As a result, after speaking with the pilots, they were forced to consider an absurd scenario that I'm sure none of you could guess. In order to unlock the door, the first officer may have accidentally trimmed the rudder hard to the left, which would have caused the plane to bank to the left due to the pilot's confusion between the door lock and the trim switches. But that raises the question of why there are two switches so close to each other, and the answer has to do with similarity. Cockpit similarity. This design has been used by earlier Boeing aircraft. Thus, Boeing retained it the same on the 737-700, allowing the pilots training to fly the new 737 to worry about one less issue. The 737's rudder trim switch is spring-loaded, meaning that when you let go of the switch, it snaps back to its center. However, because the rudder trim essentially makes no sound when the plane is in flight, the pilot would not have been immediately aware that he was deflecting the rudder and not opening the cockpit door. In addition, both switches have a similar feel, so the pilot would not have known what he was doing when the cockpit door was closed. This means that both switches feel quite similar to the touch, and if you aren't paying attention, you may accidentally press the wrong button and put your plane into a dive. The first officer used to fly the 737-500, which makes it even more intriguing. I know that all Boeing aircraft kept switches on the same panel for cockpit familiarity, but they did move them around a bit. In this photo, you can see how the switch is deferred on both aircraft because the trim switch on the Dash 500 is somewhat close to where the door selector is on the Dash 700. They weren't near to catastrophe in terms of height, but that's not the truly terrifying part, since planes had crashed before. For example, Air France Flight 447's pilots accidentally put the plane into a stall and crashed it because they were thrown an error that they were not expecting. It sounds silly, but it has happened when pilots are given situations that they cannot handle. They become startled and then can't react quickly enough and end up crashing the plane. The fact that the pilots were trained to use something as basic as the door lock selector, with a selection in the Air Operator's Manual devoted to how to do this simple task, is what I find most interesting about this crash. It just goes to show how much thought and effort has gone into creating these aircraft. How can you stop anything similar from happening again? We can, of course, teach pilots how to distinguish between the lock selector and the trim switch during training. But in my opinion, upset recovery is more crucial, because it can be useful in many more situations than just this one. To illustrate, let's think back to the crashes we previously discussed. In both cases, the plane was perfectly flyable, but with better recovery abilities, the pilots might have been able to save their aircraft. What do you think about this crash? Did you expect something similar to occur? Please share your thoughts in the comment section below. I appreciate you watching this episode of Flight Mode. If you like the videos we make, please consider liking and subscribing. I'll see you guys again soon.